All right, thank you for joining us. Yuri, thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce Yuri. He's going to read a story, and we'll jump into some questions. Yuri Herrera is the author of 3 novels translated into English: Kingdom Cons, Signs Preceding the End of the World, which won the 2016 Best Translated Book Award, and The Transmigration of Bodies. These 3 books have been collected and republished under the title 3 Novels. In 2020, he published A Silent Fury, a piece of historical reportage about a devastating mine fire and the subsequent state and corporate cover-up that occurred a century before in his hometown of Pachuca, Mexico. Most recently, Yuri has published the collection 10 Planets, which contains 20 short stories ranging from science fiction to body horror to realistic tales of the apocalyptic future that might soon await us all. We'll talk about that. These stories are frustrating, funny, and frustratingly funny, I would say. Yuri is the professor of creative writing and literature here at Tulane University. Lead us off with the story.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to all this information, because my publisher asked me to do this. Because I just published a new novel in Spanish called La Estación del Pantano, which is the retelling of the time Benito Juárez, a Mexican president, spent exiled in New Orleans between 1853 and 1855. And it's coming out in English, translated by Lisa Dillman, who has translated all my works, in September in Grey Wolf. We still don't know where we're going to present it here, but we'll find a place. Anyway, just wanted to do some advertising and self-aggrandizing moment. I'm going to read just a really, really short story, because for 2 reasons. 1, because it's better to have a conversation, and 2, because I try to keep the slaughtering of the English language to a minimum. And Lisa, my translator, has always done such a beautiful work, and sometimes I always feel that I have to apologize to her before reading it in public. So this one is called Living Muscle. There is a very distant star, nestled in a dense spiral galaxy that looks to be approaching adolescence. Classified by a couple numbers and a couple letters, no less significant than any other possible numbers and letters. It is orbited by several planets outside a habitable zone, frostily hostile or belligerently incandescent and misty, except for one halfway along, whose orbit places it, at a certain time of year, nearly as close to the star as the hotheads, and at another, nearly as far as the frosties. At first sight, it's a compact planet, no volcanoes or fault lines, but it extends and distends at regular intervals and is permanently enveloped in thunderstorms. It's a planet made of living muscle. When approaching the sun, it contracts and relaxes while rotating on its axis to keep from cooking in the star's heat. When it is distant, it retracts as if searching for a warm nucleus within so as not to turn into a diamond. We've sent a considerable number of probes to discover what lies beneath the soft tissue, but as soon as they disturb the surface, it begins to vibrate steadily until they are brought down. One thing we have managed to discover is that on its trajectory from the coldest to the warmest part of the solar system, the planet emits a sequence of vibrations following the pattern do, si, re, si, mi, si, fa, si, sol, si, and then si, sol, si, fa, si, mi, si, re, si, do, over the millions and millions of iotas it travels. It's less an inexpressive sequence than a perfectly human humming, some say. And occasionally, it completes an entire orbit in silence. We have decided to send no more probes, nor have we assigned it a name.
Thank you. All right, so I think that short story can launch us into the first question I wanted to ask. You know, one of the themes of this book, something that pops up again and again, is a lot of these stories are set on different planets, but they're also about planets, and we see kind of these life cycles of planets and life cycles of people who live on planets. I especially want to point out the first story in the collection. It's called The Science of Extinction, and it's a page and a half long. And it tells the story about a man perhaps at the end of his own life. And to borrow a title from one of your earlier books, he's also kind of witnessing the end of the world. So we're seeing kind of this cycle of planets. And he writes himself a short letter. He puts it on the window frame. And whether he later finds the letter, it's opaque, for sure. But whether he finds the letter later in his life, but he reads that letter, and there's 4 words on that letter, and it's everything, or everyone is going away. And I don't want to decode the meaning of this story or any of the stories in this book. I want to use that letter writing kind of exercise, that device of the past and future letter that a character writes to himself, to ask you about your beginnings and your childhood. What sort of writer and reader were you growing up as a young person, as a teenager? And if you want to kind of continue the exercise that you play in the book, what letter would you write to your future self if you were the last man on this planet?
I really didn't prepare for this question. That's a story about many things. It's a story about memory, about responsibility, about what we think is important, and we put it in writing, and then we forget about it. Sometimes writing is something that we do to remember things, and sometimes it's something that we do to forget in a more educated way, or to create an alibi for ourselves. Because since we put it in writing, we think that it's going to stay there, but it's just another way of forgetting. So in a way, that is a little bit a reflection on that story, because this guy knows that he's losing his mind at the same time that the world is coming to an end. So he writes this letter to himself, and then he says, who wrote this? And he doesn't understand exactly what is happening. I think that in a way that, and it's really insightful that you frame it that way, because I remember when I started writing with being really aware of writing, that I would go out and I would just like look at a dog, and I said, like, I had to write down what I saw looking at this dog, or I saw a fight on the street, and I had this sense of responsibility of putting it down on paper, because nobody was going to do it. But at the same time, it was also a discovery for myself, a discovery of the different ways in which you can talk about the world. The world is not something that has post-its attached to it, and that you just have to discover it, and there is the writing. But you have to create the object and the post-it and the act of doing it. Well, I come from a family that values books a lot. I was never pushed towards reading, because books was one of the only valuable things in my family. And my dad didn't care about cars or money, but there were books everywhere, including the bathroom. So it was something like a source of fighting, even with my brothers. And besides that, I had other very good influences. I have an uncle, my Uncle Polo, who taught himself English, and he knew a lot of things, even though he never went to college. He was always recommending me books. And then had some different experiences. When I was in the primary school in Pachuca, there was a program in which American teachers, back then, I imagined them like really old people. Now I realize that they were like 24, 25 years old. American teachers would go to teach English, and one of them would do this thing that every class, the first 10 minutes, he would say, like, just write down whatever you want. And that was a great experience for me, just to write down, not because it's a test, not because you have to register something or memorize something, but just as an act of freedom. And he also gave us to read some really crazy stories. Anyway, he left the city, and for many years I was wondering what happened with Mr. Bill. And he had a very common name, I discovered, then Bill Curtis. And at some point I said, I'm never going to find him. And 2 years ago, he sent me an email to my Tulane email saying, hey, are you my student? I remember you, and I see that you published a book, and I read it. And I was really, really glad. And his son came three weeks ago to New Orleans to something else, and I met him. So, I don't know, this just came to my mind. It's in the way that books is something that keep changing. Books keep changing. Books that you read when you were a kid and you read now, they are different books. And books keep communicating things to you depending on what space you are talking about it. Now I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop. But I don't know if I answered exactly what you...
You absolutely did. And you brought up one of your earliest teachers. I have a question about, because we both teach here at Tulane, I want to ask kind of like a pedagogical question, or to think of our role as professors here. How do you think of yourself, or what kind of teaching, or what kind of, how do you seek to inspire your students through literature, through reading, and also through writing? What do you aspire to be?
Well, it depends the class. You have to adapt to what is expected from you in each different class, and it's a graduate class or undergraduate class. But we were talking just 1 second ago that I came up this semester with an idea that I really didn't know where I was going, and I think it's working. An undergrad class that I wanted to offer the students a selection that was different from the general idea that in the United States people have about Latin American literature. And I told them, we are going to get away from the R word. And when I told them that, they thought I was saying something filthy, until I said like magical realism. It's the R word because realismo mágico. And I said, forget about this. You cannot say this here. This is something that had its place decades ago, and we should all forget about that because it doesn't help at all. So I came up with this idea called Mad Scientists, and it's just stories about crime, madness, and science. And so I just looked for stories written in Latin America that had some reflection on science, but at the same time, it's a reflection on the morality of knowledge and what we do with it. And it has been really fun. So I think that that in the case of literature, because this is something different from what is taught in other disciplines, we are there not to give a certain technique or answers, but to somehow poison the students a little bit in the way that we have to push them to ask questions, to ask better questions, to have more, to have a new vocabulary, to ask questions, to have new images. And if at the end of the semester, students have more questions than what at the beginning, I think it's a successful semester for me.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the R question, the magical realism question, because often, sometimes I'll say that word has been attached to you by critics, right, in reviews occasionally. More often, you'll see people use.
I'm gonna hunt them down.
Yeah.
Find them and hunt them down.
But more often, you'll see people write about your books and just referring to them as just imbued with this sort of darkness, dark themes, violence, death, the brutality of power. And I agree that is central to a lot of your books. I see you very much as a reader and fan of your books, as a humorist in a lot of ways. I find your books never over the top or cartoonish, never satirical, but there's a deep-seated humor there, I think, in a lot of what you write. even in your nonfiction book, which is maybe kind of the most brutal of them all because it is true realism. So how do you think of yourself if you know when people use the R word, or do you think of yourself as a humorist?
Well, I think humor is it's an essential part for me in what I do, but I try not to think of it in terms of, oh, now I'm going to make a joke. Yeah. I just try not to be too solemn. I try not to repeat other discourses. I'm really aware of the political discourses at the moment. I studied political science, but I try not to just replicate them. I try to a little bit mock them. And by mocking them, you are also making an observation that might be useful in the public sphere. And I think this relates to the other topic in that maybe the use of those words is due to a lack of sense of irony. You know, there is a song in Veracruz called La Bruja, which is just about a guy saying that the witch is coming at night and it's taking all my soul, and people would say like some scholars like, oh, these Mexicans that still believe in witches and the witches come and they take your soul. No, it's a song about sex. It's a song about a woman that comes at night and takes your soul. And when Garcia Marquez wrote about Remedios La Bella, taking a sheet from her bed and just go into the sky, it's a metaphor. We also know how to do metaphors. You know, it's not like literally we believe that those things happen. You know, but it was a very, very comfortable and somehow useful label. And it made sense for a while just to single out a specific way of doing metaphors in Latin America in the 60s and 70s. But then it became a crystallized way of understanding Latin American literature. And I think all this time, many other things have been happening, but especially now, Latin American literature is super rich and diverse, and it has nothing to do with that idea. You know?
Yeah. And I want to ask about Latin American literature, and specifically Mexican literature, and how it is being received in America right now. It seems to me that, as a reader who tries and fails to read everything ever published, that's certainly how I live my life, that translations of contemporary Mexican fiction by American publishers is hot right now. It's trendy, right? And my reading list, certainly over the past decade, has been strong in Mexican writers, and the books I've written, that I've read, I just find them phenomenal. And I wrote down a bunch of names: Valeria Luiselli, Alvaro Enrique, Pilar Quintana, Jasmina
Colombian.
Rivera.
Yeah.
Okay, she's Fernanda Melchor, yourself. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about what is happening in this present moment in Mexican fiction, and why is it being received in America? Is it being received in a new way? Is this, I also leave room, like, this just might be my, like, Anglo-American gaze, speaking, and I might be wrong about this moment. But is there something like hot and trendy going on?
Well, I think it's a question more for the publishers than for me, why they decided. What I can say is all those names that you have mentioned, include Pilar, who is Colombian, and I have taught her in my classes here, and she's amazing. All of them are really good writers, and I would expect that that's the reason why they are being published. But besides that, always publishing has to do with certain moments in the public sphere, with certain trends. And I think that, for instance, with Fernanda Melchor, who is like one of our best writers nowadays, she's offering a certain way of talking about violence that is very different from what the mainstream media is saying. Not that she is sugarcoating, but she is making it more complex, and she's creating characters instead of just stereotypes. And I think there is a segment that is that is tired of the stereotypes and that is going for that. And now, for instance, Valeria moves in between Mexico and the United States. Both she writes in English, she writes in Spanish, and she also picks topics that bridges the kind of life that she has been leading, living in different places. And in a moment in which, whether the politicians accept it or not, in a moment in which the borders have become even more absurd, writers like Valeria are especially important. Well, you mentioned Álvaro Enrique. Álvaro has an incredible register in which he can write about historical topics. He can write about the Mexica culture, about philosophers in Italy playing tennis, and he's one of the more versatile writers. So I think that it's maybe, yes, publishers are suddenly discovering something that has been happening all along, and they are going to discover a lot more, because especially with women writers in Mexico, there's a whole thing happening, which is a lot of writing in terror, and which is not a metaphor. They are creating metaphors, but at that same time they are talking about the terror of being a woman in these times, and science fiction. And so, well, I don't know if this is exactly what the publishers are thinking, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, and how do you see your place kind of in that movement, if it is a movement?
I'm not sure. I feel awkward in most places, even in my house. I remember when I arrived in New Orleans, one day in some magazine in England, they asked me to write a series of poems or aphorisms or ideas, just like one page, in English, which is something that I don't do very often. And I remember one of them was this, that when I go to a black bar, I'm white. When I go to a white bar, I'm colored. And when I go to a Hispanic bar, I'm the middle-class douchebag trying to reconnect. So that's why I drink by myself. I wish that was a metaphor. And I think that in a way that happens a little bit with me. So I have to mention, again, this last novel that I just published that is coming out in September, which is the story of Benito Juárez in New Orleans. And as I expected, it has not received many opinions. A few people have read it, and they have liked it. And one of them said something that has to do with what you're asking, I think. He said, I fear that this novel, more or less, these are not the exact words, he said, but I fear that this novel is never going to be accepted in Mexico as a Mexican novel, because it happens in New Orleans with New Orleans characters, even though there's one Mexican character, and that it's never going to be accepted in New Orleans as part of the New Orleans literary canon, because it's written in Spanish and it's written about the Mexican guy, and New Orleans is so jealous about how it preserves its own image. So I'm not sure how I fit in what is happening. In a way, part of what I was saying before is true for my books also, in that at least in Kingdom Comes and Transmigration of Bodies, there is a certain depiction of violence, and that is part of in that sense, of a certain way of talking about violence in Mexico. But besides that, I have these other books that have nothing to do with that. So I'm comfortable with that, not fitting in the place.
Yeah. I mean, I got to say, on the subject of your forthcoming New Orleans book, when I read just this week that book is real and will be out in the world soon, as someone who has dedicated his life to studying and writing about the city, I teach New Orleans history classes here at Tulane. I did a backflip. You know, I'm very, very happy. Can you talk about the research that you did going into that book? It's set in the 1850s, correct?
Yeah.
Can you talk about what you did to?
Well, the initial research was about the character, was about tracing his steps here, and there's almost nothing. There's one important document, which is the arrival of Benito Juárez on a ship. There is the thing that it's in the HNOC. They have it there, and there's another document in the diplomatic archive in Mexico City that retells a meeting that the exiles had with the Mexican consul, who was a guy working, of course, for the dictator in that moment, because they were complaining that there were news that the exiles were preparing a mercenary army to invade Mexico, and they went to the consul and said, hey, we are not doing this, and you have to say this, and the guy said, I don't give a shit what you say, I don't work for you, and they said, okay, but put that in writing, and that document exists. Besides that, there is only the same set of things that are always repeated and that come from one same source, a guy called Rafael Cabañas, who was living here, a Mexican, and who says basically 3 or 4 things. One, that Benito Juárez worked in a tobacco shop. Nobody knows where it is. If you do a quick search, you are going to find like 4 different people saying 4 different things. Oh yeah, it was this. No, nobody knows. There's absolutely no proof of this. But this is the thing. No. I assumed that it was in the quarter, but because that was the city basically back then, and I think Rafael Cabañas says that he lived in St. Peter, in the street of St. Peter, that he had yellow fever and almost died, and the black woman saved his life. So I used all these things in the novel. These are like the stones for my novel. And besides that, what I did was a lot of research about certain topics of New Orleans, because what I think is that you are who you are, not just because of what you decide, but because of what the environment does to you. And people don't think of Benito Juárez as someone who was recreated by New Orleans. And in a way, that's the whole idea of my novel, that this guy who came back and separated church and state and defeated the French and restated the Republic, and that was the most important president, this guy was recreated in New Orleans, whether you know it or not. And for that recreation, I researched and read a lot about racial relations, and about slavery, about the music, about the day-to-day life. Things very interesting. The city had was thinking of shit because the, how they call it, the drainage was open, you know, and then you would find that the way you now and then you can find here alligators on the street, and there was an obscene amount of fires. There were more than 200 fires a year, and then you have epidemics, you know. So, and on top of that, you had opera all the time. And you have the black people playing drums. And all the things that happen in between that, the opera and the slavery and the fires. And I said, like, this is just like an excess of life and violence. And what I think is that this did something in his brain that allowed him to reimagine the country to which he was going back. And just talking about this, I want to mention something to which you alluded at the beginning, that when you was asking what kind of writer I am or I was. And even when I write realistically, even when I write nonfiction, even when I write this like it's a historical novel, science fiction is always something that is really important for me, because science fiction is that genre that doesn't pretend to be a reflection on reality, but that assumes the poetic gesture that is that you have reality there and you do an aesthetic translation into words. And science fiction is always talking about reality, because that's what we have. We don't have anything else to talk about. It's always talking about reality, but in its own poetic terms, creating planets and creating other beings and creating spaceships And for me, recreating that New Orleans, even though every single thing that I say in the novel, it's in documents, it was the same kind of gesture, or I tried to do the same kind of gesture that science fiction is always doing, which is that you have to be free to just be amazed before reality, you know?
Yeah, and I think that I want to quote you on the city of New Orleans. I think you've lived here since 2011, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so in an interview, I couldn't find how far ago this interview took place, but you described New Orleans as a terrible place where extraordinary things happen on a daily basis. And now I, as someone who has lived here for a few decades now, I can't agree more with your sentiment. Like, I 100% am with you. Can you talk about your feelings? We talked about a lot about New Orleans in the book you're writing, and about going to different bars or clubs. But how have your feelings changed over time, living in the city for well over a decade now?
Well, when you spend enough time in any place, you will see all the things that are not in the tourist guides, you know, and all the things that are not in Google, the things that are very, I don't know, different things. I'm just going to give you two examples. One has to do with the passing of time. My first 2 or 3 years here, I didn't stay here during the summer. And then I started just staying during the summer, and it's incredible. Last one was hell, you know? but everybody knows it was like just dangerous stepping out. But the passing of time during the summer is something that really, it's amazing. The days are extremely long in a way that I could only compare it to when I was a child, you know, because as you age, the time starts speeding. But New Orleans is one of those places where time sort of stops during the summer. And then, even when it's not that hot, time has a different quality just because people are partying all the time and people are enjoying themselves all the time, and people are not just doing the 9 to 5, but even when they do it, they have a different way of using what the time they have to live here. And I have seen also the other side, you know. My very first good friend in New Orleans was killed like 5 years ago, and I have seen my share of violence for other reasons. And at the same time, well, then I bought a house in Poland Street, and we planted a fig tree that was just a thing like this. And today I was just looking at it. It's a whole ecosystem in itself, you know. And so these things happen all the time, and in that sense, it is a better version of the world than the cities in which they think that they have. Like, for instance, before coming here, I did my PhD in Berkeley. And people in Berkeley think of themselves like that is like the most plural and tolerant and varied city. And in its own liberal, progressive way, it's really conservative because it's like nothing moves, you know? And we can have like really cool bumper stickers, but it's an extremely organized society. Whereas New Orleans is extremely disorganized in the way the world is. And it's extremely beautiful, and it's dangerous. And politicians here, nobody has illusions in New Orleans towards politicians, you know. We know why the streets are like that. And it's, in that sense, a very realistic and lucid way of looking at the world. Anyway, as any person here, we can just be for hours giving examples of this. So it's better that I stop with that.
Let's open it up to questions. Any questions out there in the audience? And please come up to the mic, yeah.
So while, is this on?
not sure, but we can hear.
Yeah, anyway. So a while ago, Borges wrote a speculative fiction story about a library that seemed to be infinite. Where you,
La
are you
Biblioteca de
familiar with that
Babilonia.
one? Sorry?
La Biblioteca en Babilonia.
Right, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think of the story?
Well, I just reread it because in this class about mad scientists, even though Borges does not directly speaks about mad scientists, he always has a reflection on knowledge, then the nature of knowledge and the morality about knowledge, and how knowledge can drive us crazy, you know. And in the library in Babylon, what he says is that the library is a series of hexagons, and that, of course, is a concrete library, but at the same time, it's infinite because you can never really know where it starts and where it finishes. And not only that, but that it says that at some point, the people that created it, they had this limited number of signs, alphabetic signs, and that all the books that could have been written have already been written.
That's
and
the
that,
suspicion anyway.
And that they are there,
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
And I was talking with my students about it, and I said, this is Borges' definition of an algorithm, you know? And,
Yes.
but this doesn't mean that he has a conservative view of literature, like everything has already been written.
Right.
Let's just lay on our backs and look at the sky because there's nothing else. But it's an irony about it. And I said the way I read it is that we have to create against the algorithm, or if not against, just not being too worried about the algorithm. And this is a really present discussion with the whole artificial intelligence.
Yes.
The artificial intelligence is not intelligence. It's an algorithm.
Yes.
And we can always do things outside the algorithm. So that that's the way I can read that story. But that story, as any Borges story, can be read in 20 different ways. And that's why I enjoy including it in class, because I always say, people who have never read Borges before, it's like passing their brains through oil to really hot oil, and then it's like you are someone different after that, you know. Thank you.
You mentioned that someone made a comment about, I think it's a book that's coming out, about how it may not be accepted here and it may not be accepted in Mexico. I was wondering how important do you feel it is for either your work or books in general to be accepted by either a country or a group of people?
That is a question that requires an honest answer, which is something that we don't do very often when we're in front of a. And I would say that the very first part of it is that it's a matter of ego. Of course we want to be accepted. That's why when we start writing, we only show it to our moms and girlfriends and friends because, you know, they are going to do this, you know. But then, when you start doing it in a more consistent way, it's important to show it to people that are not going to accept it, because then you learn something about yourself. And for me, the most important thing in writing is this balance between self-criticism and self-assurance, because sometimes you just have to don't give a shit about what people think and you say, this is what I want to say, and I don't care. And sometimes you just have to be humble and intelligent enough to listen to criticism. So yeah, it feels good to be accepted. It feels good to be read. But I was trying not to say the word, but the magical thing of books is that it's not that you are read by a million people, but when you truly connect with someone, even if you are never gonna meet that person. And I think what happens with bestsellers is that it's less a matter of that telepathy that I think that happens with literature, and it's more a matter of consumption. I think with a certain kind of bestsellers, I was going to say names, but there's no need to do that. It's just about depositing something easy to consume on someone else's brain, and for me, is more about just creating some conflict. with that other brain. So yeah, it is important, but eventually you just have to think that you have no control over that. And there have been great writers that have been widely accepted, and there have been writers that didn't want to be accepted, and we should always go back to Kafka. He barely published, and he didn't want to be read, and he was able to do this thing that we keep saying. Even people who have never read Kafka say the word Kafkaesque, which speaks about his influence and the way he has been accepted in general in culture. Thank you.
Hi, I just want to ask, so what are some things about the science fiction genre that makes it so worth writing about and even just reading things?
Well, there are two terms that I don't like when people label certain literature. I don't like when people say, I write realistic literature, and I don't like when they say, I write experimental literature. And I don't think, because the realistic label says like, I am talking about reality unlike all the other people that are just talking about werewolves and vampires. Werewolves and vampires are ways to speak about horrible people or about sexy people, or I don't know. It's a way to underlining something that is better than just saying horrible or sexy. And I don't like the idea of experimental, because for me, if you are not experimenting, you're not doing literature. You're just repeating someone else's discourse. You're just writing guides to assemble a furniture, And science fiction in that sense, well, originally, science fiction, the term was like a fiction that is based on science. So you would take certain scientific ideas and just develop them in order to create something poetic. And now I think that term talks about more things, the speculative and a certain way of doing poetry in narrative. And I like that a lot because, it's by definition a genre that is not constrained by any of those things that I mentioned, by reality, and by this it's just a version of reality, it's not reality, or by what is understood as experimentalism, because science fiction is always creating its own boundaries, its own beings, its own distances,
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question if someone wants to rush up to the mic, which is in the center.
Hi, I'm just curious. I know you've used like pre-Columbian mythology and such in your novels, and I'm wondering how you see that relating to that poetic impulse with science fiction, and whether you have you found anything in New Orleans that is similar.
Well, the pre-Hispanic input is especially in Science Preceding the End of the World, where I use the narrative of the descent to Mictlan as the structure of the novel, and I use the names of Mexica gods as a sort of the names of the characters in the first chapter, and some other ideas that come from the Mexica cosmovision. And what I always say is that for me it was really important, to take an object that comes from a culture that has disappeared, from a world that has disappeared, and put it in the middle of your world and see what it does, And I like what it did there, because it created some strangeness that was necessary for that story about discovering new lands and discovering a new language. And I think that same thing could be said about how science fiction works, but then the weird objects are ourselves, just going through the universe, and the universe doesn't care about that. It's not that the universe is weird. It's our relation with the universe that creates this tension or this friction, and for me that is one of the principles that I want to practice whenever I write, whether it is openly science fiction or is something else that supposedly is more attached to reality. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd like to thank our speaker today. It was a great session. The books from our, oh yeah, clap.